My name is Jen Riddell. I am a plant biologist and I am with the California Native Plant Society today.
Hi, my name is Michael Jones. I am the University of California Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties.
Hello, I'm Mary Maeda. I'm the North Coast Forester for the Natural Resources Conservation Service.
It's really important to remember that fuels reduction is a year-to-year, right, kind of approach, that we're thinking about the immediate risk of that year and removing those fuels to manage for the wildfire season that's coming up. But as Mary mentioned, the long-term goal here is to improve the overall forest health and condition of the stand, to make it more resilient long-term, to have trees that are resilient to fire, that are healthy and disease and insect-free, so that we can have a condition that's more sustainable into the future, and we're less worried about the fire risk moving on and not having to go every year we got to worry about fire and cut the fuels out.
Creating a resilient forest, and what does that really mean? That means individual trees. We want fewer larger trees, and so our goal with fuel reduction is really aiming to remove mainly smaller, weaker trees that would stand less of a chance in the case of a wildfire. And what we're really looking, the basics of fuel reduction, is increasing the distance of vegetation both on a horizontal and vertical axis. Too many small trees. We want to be pushing our stands, our forests, to have fewer larger trees. And that is going to be a healthier stand, and it's going to be a more fire resilient stand, and a more insect disease and drought tolerant stand. Keeping what we call a thrifty tree, and that is a tree that is growing well, and also our larger trees, which are inherently going to be more fire resilient. Look at this guy. Look how thin its crown is. It only has green foliage on one side. This is what we call a weak suppressed tree. I want to take this out.
So maybe we have that little Doug fir seedling sapling, and we have that bay, so maybe we're just spacing out our small regen as well and kind of thinning it out and having that diversity built into the regeneration.
So with our resprouting hardwoods, our madrone, our tan oak, our bay laurel, think about whenever you make a cut, it's going to have multiple stems come back. Are we making a worse problem then? Are we going to come back and follow up and thin out those sprouts later? That's something you have to think about.
Douglas firs are really good to cut all the way to the ground as close as you can get. They won't stump sprout, but madrones will. So if you leave any material, that madrone's just going to grow right back up. So it's probably better to limb a madrone up.
Our goals and objectives are to open up the space for emergency vehicles to go by, and it's also to reduce density, to have fewer trees on the landscape, both for fuel reduction and for increasing health and reducing competition.
I guess in the little spot we're standing in, let's just start talking about the species that we're working with. And right now we're in this little pocket of like tan oak. And what's really important about that is that there's an invasive disease called sudden oak death that is killing tan oak, and we're actually standing in some of that mortality. There's trees with the brown leaves standing, like those ones right there, kind of behind us. You see how that smaller tree has just all the brown foliage, the brown leaves on it? Yeah, and then if you look, it's hard to see, but up on the kind of further up above us, there's a bunch of tan oak in there too. So what's happening is this disease is killing these tan oak. And so when we're thinking about managing, and this question is much larger than just for fuels reduction, but managing for forest health in general, is this disease is going to kill tan oak. There's no way, we can't really stop it. It's just running through and it's causing a lot of mortality. So, right, we have dead trees now that we should be removing, but we have living trees that are going to die too, and so it's going to be adding potential fuel in the future and having a potential effect on fire behavior. So part of thinking about this is what's going to happen in the future, as we've been saying, and how do we think about thinning? Do we take more tan oak? Do we take the same amount that we would normally and then just have to come back and continually manage the mortality as it occurs? What's the strategy there? And it's pretty tricky and complicated because, as we were talking about before, every time you cut a tan oak, it resprouts. So if we take a bunch of tan oak right now, because we know sudden death is going to kill them, we've now created a bunch of shrubby regeneration that's adding to fuel loading. So it's an interesting kind of conundrum, right? How do we think about this? How do we balance these needs? I don't know. We don't really have a good answer. I think we do know that you don't want to just remove all the tan oak, right? You don't want to get rid of all of them. You want diversity. We talked about how important diversity is in forest health and the resiliency of the stand. We don't want to kill all the tan oak. There's no point in that.
Yeah, I don't think our scope of work is to clear cut everything.
Yeah, you don't want to clear cut. You don't want to do conversion or anything like that. But we definitely need to think about, there's a lot of tan oak in here. Let's thin it out. Let's maybe space it out more so we can slow down the spread. Definitely take out the dead trees and try to open it up a little bit so that maybe we can recruit some more growth of other tree species that aren't susceptible to sod. So it's a complicated factor, right? Invasive diseases and insects complicate forest management beyond. It makes it almost impossible to even think about long term how you're going to manage for something when you kind of have this vision of a lot of destruction and mortality.
We talked about how land use history has changed what it looks like now, and a lot of that in the beginning was logging and then the suppression of fire. And so if you look at our old stumps, we have some big old redwood stumps.
There's a big old fir up there.
Yep, and we have big old Douglas fir stumps. So we did have some of those big Doug fir here. And now what do we have? We still have some bigger Doug fir, we have some redwood, but the most abundant species right now is tan oak, and that's really a legacy of past management, because like Mike said, we opened up growing space for this species that resprouts from the base very easily. So how do we manage now to reduce our fuels, and is there a way we can kind of promote more healthy Doug fir and redwood without eliminating our other species, right? When you do have these big trees coming down, the fuel loading that you want to take care of first are the tops and the limbs. It's that smaller, flashier stuff. I like leaving some bigger tree trunks on the ground, in contact with the ground, because again, they're not as flammable, they're decomposing slowly. They're actually very good habitat for, you have amphibians, you have reptiles, you have small mammals. It's actually really great habitat, and you want more complex habitat.
So this goes back to what Mary was talking about with, you space things out vertically, so you don't have fuel ladders, but you can space things out horizontally so that you could leave a bush and then have another bush 20 feet away, rather than just cut them all down, if you're thinking about habitat.
I almost hate to ask this, but what are the implications for sudden oak death in this stuff relative to chipping and broadcasting?
Ooh, okay.
Keep it on site.
Yeah, that's the thing. So there is a zone of infestation as recognized by the state for sudden oak death, but basically that zone of infestation is all of the coastal counties from Del Norte down to Monterey or San Luis Obispo. Within that zone of infestation, there's no regulation, right? You can move stuff around, but best management practices are to leave it on site. We know sod is here. We know sudden oak death is here. You're going to be working in areas where it's not established yet, or it's just beginning to get established, and you do not want to help with that migrated assistance movement of that disease. So really, the MPs is good sanitation, keeping all your material on site, or burning or sanitizing your equipment, and if you do have to move it, making sure you're not moving to areas that aren't infected yet. A little bit, but a really important thing to remember about pruning is we don't want to take too much of the living canopy, because that's how the tree survives, right? That's how it produces food. So generally a good rule of thumb is 30%, no more than 50. This tree is obviously, like, we're given the prescription we would take this tree, but this is a really good example because it's nice full like Christmas tree canopy, and we can visualize what 30 or 50% looks like. Just think about if you took 50% of that tree's canopy, that's a lot. That's a really significant stress to that tree. Maybe not so much this time of year because they're starting to kind of do their winter thing, but imagine if you were doing this work in the spring, which is very likely you'll be thinning year round whenever you have the contract. And if this tree is just waking up out of dormancy or out of its like torpor, and it's starting to move water and produce sugars, and you take away like 50% of its capacity to feed itself, you could potentially kill that tree. And so you want to make sure that we don't do that. We don't cause unintentional damage and mortality through these practices. So we want to really minimize how much we're taking. And if we need to take more, maybe we take a little bit at first and then come back at another entry and take a little bit more to get to what we want. But just make sure you always have that just always have a good view of the canopy and think about how much of that am I taking, and think about where the branches lead to. Like a branch may start lower on the ball, but it may be a significant part of the canopy that you take that, and you could remove a lot of that foliage. So yeah, to meet prescription, if you have to take more than 50% of the canopy, then that's probably a take tree. Yeah, for sure.
Does that really help if you're maybe reducing some ladder fuel, but you're increasing the fuel on the surface? No, it doesn't.
Put it on the bottom.
Our surface fuels are our drivers of fire, actually. And having it up against the trunk of the tree.
Even worse, huh?
Exactly, because it's going to light on fire and it's going to burn for a while, and it can actually cook the cambium or the living tissue of that tree. So when we do fuels reduction, thinking about what we do with the slash is really important, because just putting it on the ground actually is not helping your cause.
When you see a baby oak, in my perspective, you protect it because we don't have a lot of them and we want them to survive.
One of the reasons why I want to leave a high number of diverse species is because we don't know what's going to happen in the future with climate change, with disease, with different droughts, with insects. We can have something take out a whole species, and then what's going to be left. So that's why it's so important to leave this high diversity, because we're just hedging our bets for the future. So this is another way to think about what you're cutting too. You can find these really unique trees, these really large ones that you want to keep, and work your way out. We call it radially thinning it. So you start from there and you just take things away from it, because you want that tree to have a lot of room and you don't want to have a lot of ladders into it. So you can see here we have a lot more of our white oaks around the edge where they're getting a lot of light. This is also probably a different soil type here, but this is a really habitat rich area where we call it an ecotone. So it's kind of the transition between a grassland and a more evergreen forest. And again, what do you see around the edges?
Brush.
Yeah, all that brush, which is great bird habitat, but it's also great ladder fuels, right? And so it's just, if you imagine a fire coming through here, it's going to burn low.
Right there,
Yeah, low on the grass. It's going to hit that brush and it's going to ladder up into the canopy. So when fuel reduction is your goal, you want to eliminate that brush there, or just leave one kind of isolated by itself. But we wanted to talk about the legacy of land use here and evidence of past logging, which of course are the stumps, but also right now we're standing on a skid trail. So these are the trails that they got logs out of the woods on. Yeah, so skid trails can be sources of erosion and sediment. They can be great ways to walk around the forest and access the forest. And they're also kind of clear areas that if you're doing pile and burning, they're great places to put your piles on. They're usually gentler slopes. You're not going to have a lot what we call rollout, where something on fire can leave the pile and roll down the hill. When you're working in steeper areas like this, these are key areas to place your slash to deal with. And down.
all the way around.
Yeah, I know you guys are working hard and you're trying to move fast, but sometimes if you're thinking about long-term ecology and leaving the landscape in a state where it's going to look better in 10 years, slowing down a little bit and looking up and looking down is always really helpful. And knowing your plants is just fun. So not just helpful in terms of like knowing what you're doing, but it's also really fun to just know what you're seeing and interacting with and what you can do to make the forest healthier.